Welcome to Curious Coaching, the Sport Northern Ireland podcast for coaches who are driven to explore new ways, thirsty for new ideas, and passionately curious about how they can maximise the power of sport through great coaching. The podcast that seeks not to answer coaching questions, but to provoke them.
Hello and welcome to the first ever episode of the Curious Coaching Podcast. With you today is myself, Michael Cook, and my colleague, Simon Toole. We're delighted to be talking with current Stoke manager and former Northern Ireland manager, Michael O'Neill.
Michael, you're really welcome to the Curious Coaching Podcast. First guest on the brand new podcast, so we really appreciate your time today.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
So we're going to get straight into it, and obviously we're familiar with your recent coaching career, when all that was achieved with Northern Ireland, and now obviously doing really well with Stoke. Can you talk us through how you made the transition into coaching in the first place, and maybe where you've been along that journey so far?
Yeah, I suppose obviously I haven't played, in the UK for the best part of 15, 17 years, at various clubs and various levels. I didn't necessarily know whether I was going to go into coaching when I was coming towards the end of my career. I actually worked outside of football for a brief period as well when I worked in financial services actually. So it wasn't something that when I was playing I automatically thought I was naturally going to go into. And the first step I took to coaching essentially was, I got the opportunity to go and do my B licence with the Scottish FA. And because I was an international player, they had a special course on mainly for Scottish international players, but because I was in Scotland, they permitted me to be part of that. And that was the first time that sort of, I suppose, whet my appetite for it. And then I then completed my A licence. And by that time, in all honesty, whilst I had the qualifications, I still wasn't coaching. I wasn't working at a club, and I was coming to the end of my playing career, and ultimately, starting to work in finance. So that was where I was at that point. And then, having been away from the game for maybe a couple of years, and my only involvement essentially was doing some media work with the BBC Northern Ireland, rather, on the Northern Ireland International Games. I sort of was tempted to go back. I wanted to know whether I was any good actually at having gone through the qualifications. I was actually contemplating potentially going to America to explore coaching in that capacity as well. And then I went to Cowdenbeath with a friend of mine, Mixu Patalainen, and started there as his assistant manager. And that was the start of it for me.
Thanks, Michael. So did you see, obviously you seemed from the outside to progress quite quickly within your coaching career. Did it feel quick to you in terms of your progression through that and your learning through that, or was it something that looks like an overnight success to a lot of us, but actually it's 10 or 15 years in the making?
No, I think it probably did move quite quickly. You see a lot of players now coming out of football and they're trying to pick and choose jobs a little bit because of the nature of, particularly as a manager, where you're, if you do badly in your first job, you might never get another opportunity again. And I didn't have that kind of luxury because I'd come away from the game and I wasn't in a situation where possibly, I'm still playing and I'm seen as an older, experienced player, and you maybe get the opportunity as an interim manager or a caretaker manager. You do well for half a dozen games and next thing you're the manager, and some people have been able to do that, and they've done it sometimes at quite a high level in the game. So when I started at Cowdenbeath, as I said, as an assistant coach, it became quite clear to me that after a couple of months that I wasn't really suited for that role at that time. I wanted to be the head coach. So after 3 months, I left and interviewed for the job at Brecon City and got the job. And so I was very much, that happened quite quickly, to be honest. I didn't expect to maybe be in a management position as quickly as that. But when the opportunity came, I thought, well, why not? I've got to test myself. And that was whilst it wasn't at any great level, I mean, they were in the equivalent of the Scottish Championship now, but they were bottom of the table and they were going to be relegated. They were a part-time club. But it was a great place for me to start because I had to do everything and I had to do so much of it myself. And, that was where really I did cut my teeth, and it was a great learning experience. And I always say to any aspiring young coach, don't be put off by those things, because it's more about the people you're working for in your first job than what the job is perceived to be. And certainly at Brecon, I had a great board, very supportive, a really good chairman. And, I always felt, even when we had a couple of sticky periods, that I had their support. And, that was crucial, particularly as a young manager.
Michael, one of the things that we're really into in this podcast is how coaches learn and how they progress and how they develop. And I remember you speaking at our Game Changer conference last September. Feels like a long time ago now.
Yeah.
And one of the things that struck me was that you're a lifelong learner, someone who's passionate about improving and learning. And I'm really interested to know, what has been the most profound learning experience so far in your coaching career?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, really. Yeah, I do like to learn, and even at this point, up until taking the job at Stoke, I was doing a master's in sport and directorship in Manchester, which I felt was something that would benefit me down the line in my own career, and possibly a switch of role from being a manager to possibly being a sport and director within an organisation. But ultimately, the best learning is always on the job. I have to say that. Like the coaching badges, I really enjoyed doing the coaching badges. I really enjoyed looking for new material, new ways to coach, new ways to think about how you structure your sessions, all of those kind of things. But you learn most on the job, and the biggest thing that I have found in management is how you deal with the people, and that's not just the players, that's your support staff, that's the people above you, the people who, if they talk about managing up, which is a big part of the job, particularly in football management, and that's where I've probably learned the most. And I think it's probably one of the areas that I'm probably strongest in, to be honest, without having been in that position before. That is something I probably took to quite naturally. Other people have different skill sets. People I know have got maybe better coaching qualifications than I have, or better coaching attributes rather than I have, but aren't as good in terms of managing the people. And I think that's one of the most important things as well, is that the team you put together is everyone brings something maybe that you don't have, or brings a certain skill that's not as strong as you're not as strong in that area. So that's one of the things I've learned, and I've always tried to do. But I've really learned a lot, I think, on this last course, particularly around leadership, and how leadership is continually changing, and how you have to evolve as a leader as well. And I think now in my role, that's probably the key thing for me, to continue to learn and continue to think about new ways in terms of how you do lead a group, how you do lead a club, and how you're perceived as a leader as well.
And on that transition from international into the club game, which you just experienced, how has that been with regards learning and development going into a new environment?
Yeah, there's hardly been any time to analyse that until the recent situation, to be honest. And that's one of the things that it has given me, is it's given me a time to reflect on what's happened in the 4 months that I was in Stoke before the COVID-19 situation. And so, I look back and look at what changes I've made within the club, within the personnel, and I think that's something that you have to do. You have to reflect on a day-to-day basis, as opposed to international management, where you do a lot of distant management of the players. You have them together for very short windows, 9 days of very, very intense work. In the day-to-day basis within the club, you can close the door, and they've gone. You know, it's so. But you go through the next day and you have to meet the challenges again. And so it's. I think more than anything, it's trying to look ahead a little bit of where you're going to see problems. I think it's how you prepare, and I think you have to work very efficiently in club management, because the period of preparation between games is small, and it wasn't at an international level because you had 2 games in a short space of time. But what you also had is you had a big preparation period leading into that, which you don't have in club football. You would have that with a pre-season, which obviously I've not had the pleasure of having that yet with Stoke City. So I think it's just how you adapt, what you learn to what's important, or learning what's important, because everything will not be perfect. You have to tolerate some situations that you would like to be better. You know, in my situation, obviously, I've inherited a lot of staff, so there's a process there from them getting to know me, from me getting to know them. They understanding what I want, what my standards are. So there's a continual learning process for everyone in the building, I think, when a new manager comes in. But the biggest thing, I think, is not to try and change everything too quickly, because we were in a difficult position as a club, and the last thing we needed to do was just take a red pen through everything and say, well, we need to change everything too quickly. So any changes that we've made have been pretty calculated. They've been, we've assessed the situation, and I think hopefully they've made improvements.
Brilliant. And I suppose just continuing on that theme of learning, the title of our podcast is the Curious Coaching Podcast, and we're interested what makes coaches curious right now. And I'd like to pose that question to you. Is there anything in the world of coaching at the minute that's making you quite curious, making you want to learn more about?
Yeah, I've actually used this time for that, quite a bit. I'm actually looking at a model, without giving too much away, about how the game is analysed and possibly could be analysed differently. And that's something I'm very interested in, and it may mean that we have more significant information to feed back to the players, both post-game and also during game as well, so that we're evaluating how we are as a team, more on how efficient we are as a team. We tend to, in football, we tend to talk, there's a lot of statistics, and everyone talks about from the running distance of the player to the high intensity running to number of attempts on goal, number of corners, possession, number of passes. There's any number of statistics, but sometimes they don't all marry up and correlate to what the result is. And it's trying to find the right, I suppose, information to get as big a correlation with results. And there'll always be things that upset that, so that we're focusing on the right information for the players, and we're measuring ourselves as a team in terms of how efficient we are as a team, rather than just to be able to say, well, we had 25% more possession of the ball than the opposition, but actually we still lost the game. So those types of scenarios, well, if that is the situation, why did that happen? As opposed to, why you can be quite general in that sense and say, okay, we didn't have enough cutting edge, we weren't as productive in the final third. All things that you say all the time as a manager, and you say them in the media time and time again. But it's about drilling down behind that sort of general statement to give specifics to players, because ultimately the information has to change the decision-making process of the players on the pitch to be more efficient as a team. That's what you're trying to influence as a coach, really, more than anything. How your team plays. If your team plays badly, more often than not, it's because your players have made more poor decisions in the game, and that's a big factor. And so it's the hardest thing as a coach to influence his players' decision making, because it's split second. But hopefully, as I say, I'm always looking at ways where maybe players will self-analyze a little bit better, and we can analyze better as a team as well, and maybe come away a little bit from the more traditional methods of looking at that.
And that's really interesting. It reminds me of that old phrase, everything that matters can't be measured, and everything that's measured doesn't matter. And identifying what are the key things that need to be measured that can have an impact on progress and development.
100%, yeah, exactly. And football's maybe one of those games which hasn't had that level of statistics in it till more recently. You know, I think beforehand we would have always been a little bit less resistant. If you looked at how, for example, you know, rugby was being coached from the coach in the stands with a laptop and a team around him. Football's not at that point yet. I think it's starting to possibly move in that direction. I think more and more data will be at hand for coaches in terms of, it'll be live data in terms of whether it's physical data, whether it's game specific data in terms of performance level or how that's measured, and you'll actually have live access to that data. But whereas, you know, in the current format, you know, you're still making substitutions or tactical switches off what you're seeing from the sideline or from what information you're getting in the stand. That, I think, what we're going to have to do as coaches, and having seen some of the data that UEFA and FIFA are able to produce on the games, I think we're going to have to be more data receptive, and possibly we're going to have to manage with a little bit more data in the equation as well.
So, Michael, I'm actually quite interested in your answer, and a couple of things you've said around the latter part of that. You sort of highlighted UEFA and FIFA, but also rugby. Those curiosities, is that something that you've seen yourself, and just from looking at the game, or is it from others that starts to nearly prick some thoughts with you about actually how could that apply in my context?
Yeah, I think so. You always have to look at, in any team sport, how the game is coached. I think it's the one thing that is consistent. There's obviously very little similarities between rugby and football, but the similarity exists between the coach and the player relationship is where there's similarities, and that's where I think as a coach and a manager you learn. And it's, you know, interesting to me to see how the game is viewed in rugby, where, you know, the coach really assumes a non-emotional position in terms of where he takes his position in the stadium, whereas the coach in football is in the most emotional position on the pitch. You couldn't get too further contrast, and the whole time when you're in the technical area, you're trying to be analytical in football and try and not be over emotional, so your decision making is a combination of the two. Whereas when you in rugby, I find that, like, how do they deal with not being in the emotional side of the game to the same extent as they would be if they were at the side of the pitch, for example. So those are things that intrigue me. Different sports, you know, I watch like basketball, and you look at the proximity to the coach to the players in a game of basketball, for example, and that interaction is probably a lot more regular because the game's a lot more start. Same with American football, different situations, and all of that does fascinate me because, you know, the key to any manager is that relationship with the team as well, because we talk about tactics, and tactics is part of things, and people are tactical geniuses, but more often than not, you know, for me, I think it's the relationship part of it that is real key, because if that's strong, the information will be received, and that's the most important thing. Because look, if you can have the best information in the world, but ultimately if it's not received by the person you're giving it to, it doesn't serve any purpose. So I think that's very important, is know your audience as well, in terms of how you give, you know, sometimes I've seen coaches overcoach or be too detailed for the level of the player that they're dealing with, or with the level of the age group that they're dealing with. And it's not about you displaying how much you know, it's about trying to give what you do know to someone so it makes him better. And I think that's, particularly for young coaches, I think that's a challenge, because there's a natural thing that you want to show that you have this capability, and you want to show I'm good and I have this level of knowledge, where actually it may not be what the group of players in front of you needs at that minute in time.
Do you ever see yourself sitting in the stands looking down, or do you think the relationship part of that, it's like that balance between analytics and player relationship? Will the player relationship keep you on the sideline?
Yeah, it's difficult. There's often times that I wish I was watching the game from the stand. Difficult. I think it would be quite hard to watch the game from the stand because of the nature of the crowd in football and how they behave at times. It's such a different. You look at where obviously rugby have a position of where they're watching it from behind a glass screen and a glass box, and so I do think from an analytical point of view, it would certainly be beneficial. What I do have is that I have someone that I trust implicitly in the stand that's communicating with me all the time. So that's very important. So we have another member of the staff in constant dialogue with the person that's in the stand, the eye in the stand, and that information is fed down quite a lot. We are able to receive now live information, albeit with a slight delay in terms of what we're filming can be sent to the dugout to an iPad now, so we're able to view certain situations. But I do think it's quite difficult to detach yourself from the emotional side of the game in football, and the players would find that's quite strange, I think, and that would be a little bit of concern. It doesn't seem to be the big, rugby players seem to adapt to it, but it is interesting, and it'll be interesting to see how things change and move in the next few years to see whether we see more of that analytical approach from coaches. But at the minute, the technical area is still the domain of the football manager.
Oh, absolutely. Some really, really interesting stuff there, and a couple of things. Certainly, when we were thinking about this interview, that we were interested in asking you, have really come through there. Both in terms of the team around you, I suppose, and the team behind the team, essentially, but also in terms of player relationships, which has come through really strong from what you've said so far. And I know in a recent interview you had said for the manager who follows you at Northern Ireland, player relationships, I think I'm quoting you correctly, were what you saw as the most important thing. So what have you done with players that has really built those relationships and left that as a real strength for your coaching?
Yeah, I do think it is very important. I think it'll be very important who takes over as Northern Ireland manager, because you have a good group of players there who were very responsive. We had good relationships, really strong relationships. They're built up over time, and they're built up over a lot of good times as well. It's very difficult to build relationships through bad times. It's a much bigger challenge. Players are disillusioned, they're unhappy, they're disappointed when results aren't going their way. And as a coach, you find it more difficult. You're frustrated with them as well. And certainly that it was more difficult for me to build those relationships in my first campaign, where results were far more difficult to get. But I do think you have to persevere with that. You have to bring it down to, at times, a personal level. And I always wanted the players, I always said to the players, the worst thing I'm ever going to do to you is either not pick you for the squad, or pick you for the squad and not put you on the pitch. It says otherwise you're going to get a cap. So those are the three options that I have as a manager. I'm never going to, for example, take away your contract. I'm never going to ask you to take a wage cut. I'm never going to ask you to do this. International football is about representation. So I outline, and I think that allowed me to develop a relationship with them, where they would see me as someone that was to help them. Because I always said to them, look, the most important thing for me is that I have as many players playing at as high a level as possible. So my job is to try and help you with that. So whether players were in difficult situations at their club, needed some help or guidance, whether they needed me, for example, to pick the phone up to a manager at another club and say, look, would you be interested in this player? This is what. So always giving them, trying to be as positive as possible about your players, and that they saw you as someone that was there to help them. Now, when it came to picking them or not picking them, they just had to accept that. And when you leave players at the team, sometimes there's a need to explain that, sometimes there isn't. But I think overall, even the players that didn't play, I would like to think that they would have said, well, I know that if I'd ever picked the phone up to Michael, he would have tried to help me. If I was in a difficult situation at my club, he would have tried to help me. And I think that was where, as a manager, I think that's where you have to probably take it more to a personal level, and international management allows you to do that. Club level is different because you can manage the players in a slightly different way because they're contracted to the club, as opposed to, that doesn't happen at international level. Like if a player's unhappy at international level, he just may not decide to turn up, and there's not very much you can do at that point in time. But at a club, you've got more tools, you've got more, I suppose, things that you can use in your favour. That relationship doesn't have to be as pleasant all the time. It can be difficult. Sometimes you're not going to have a smooth relationship with every player at a club. And the one thing that I have found is, and the one thing that I've had to adapt to the most, is the emotional side of picking a team sometimes nearly every 3 days when you're playing a midweek game, and leaving players out and seeing how they react to that, and going through the period of like 2 days silence from a player because you've left them out of the team. And the emotions in club management are much more up and down because you're dealing with that much more frequently than you would be as an international manager. And that's probably the thing that I've had to try and adapt to the most in all of the situations that I've had to deal with.
Okay, thank you. So breaking into the other half of that, then, you've obviously put the team behind the team together quite a few times now at different clubs into Northern Ireland, and now back into club management again. And you've spoken about somebody you really trust in an analytics role in the stand. What is it that you look for when you're putting together a team around you who are really going to help you to be as successful as you can be as a coach?
The first thing is their standard of work, obviously, is key. And there's a really big part of the success we had at Northern Ireland was we had good people with good standards, and they were good people, in fact, as well, so that they integrated very well with each other. It's very important that in an international environment, because again, you're together and it's very intense, 10, 11 days in a hotel. The Euros, for example, we were at 40 days together. So that's very testing on all relationships. So, the doctor plays a major part in that, not only the coaching staff, the medical staff, the support staff in terms of liaison people and, kit men all through. And it's very important that you have those relationships as strong as possible. And people are comfortable in each other's environment, and that takes time as well. So I do think that it is about, at the end of the day, you have to drive standards as the manager, but internally the people that you employ hopefully will drive the standards as well. But the other thing is that they can work together, that they're prepared to accept their role within the team and what it is at that point in time. And when you get situations where that doesn't work, then you get problems, and those are when you have to address that. That's when you have to address that. And Jimmy Nicholl was brilliant for me because as an assistant manager, he had a real feel for what was happening around the hotel, around the camp, and that was experience on his part. And he has a unique kind of thing that he's the oldest member of our staff, bar one of the kit men, I think. And yet Jimmy, he was happy. He could have conversed with a 17, 18-year-old player if necessary. He had that ability to mix across a broad spectrum of people, and everyone had it, would listen to him, but everyone liked him as well. And that's really important as well. You can't have everyone just about standards all the time, and it takes a little bit of the human aspect of it, because everyone isn't just going to always meet those standards. There has to be a level of tolerance in that as well, or else you'll eventually get to the point where players will switch off.
So one of the things you spoke about earlier in the interview as well was around your ability, and I think you were referring to this as a strength in your coaching, and certainly from the outside it would seem to be to manage people around you. And again, that's another example you've just highlighted. Would you see that as your super strength as a coach, or is there something else you think within your coaching that would stand out as the number one ability that you have?
Oh. Excuse me. Hopefully that's not on camera, is it? What is my? I wouldn't say no. It's my super strength. I think it's definitely one of the strongest parts of my management. I think now, for example, it changes all the time, because as an international manager, you don't do a lot of coaching because you spend long periods without the players. I'm now in a situation where I'm back amongst players. So I'm almost like starting to redevelop my coaching skills. You know, I always felt when I was at Brecon and Shamrock Rovers, I did everything. I was a good coach. I was comfortable on the pitch. International football, I delegated a bit more. I didn't coach as much, so you feel as if your skill set is not as sharp as it could be at times. And now I have to sharpen it up a little bit. So I suppose what would I say is, I think probably my biggest strength is putting the right people together and maximising the output of that group of people. I know that maybe sounds a bit waffly, but in the sense of saying, what do we need at this point in time that will make us better, and finding the right person to do that. And that's a big challenge. It's a big challenge in football clubs, and it's a big challenge in a group of people. We had it, you know, at different times. You know, our team evolved with Northern Ireland. We just didn't start off and have this great team. People left. You know, Andy Massey was a great doctor, but he left and went to work at Liverpool. I had to bring David White in. Knew he would fit in well, and then I had to bring. You know, I brought Jimmy Nicola in at a time, and then Stephen Robinson left. I had to, you know, you're constantly evolving, and that's the challenge of a manager, of when those situations arise, that you bring in the right people. And I suppose that's possibly where I would say that I'm quite strong in that sense, that I kind of know what's needed for the group at when moments like that occur, and I know what I want from my team in terms of not just their standards, but how they are about it, because what we want in terms of what the output is for the players, and then hopefully being able to communicate that and obviously realise that on the pitch as well.
No, absolutely, and I think from the outside looking in, certainly one of the things that that you would observe, one of the things, and we haven't actually been able to do it in this case, but one of the things we're keen to do through this series is also to speak to an athlete or a player who's being coached by the coach that we're talking about.
Right.
We haven't been able to speak to a player, but sort of been scoring interviews. And I know there's been lots of stuff, obviously, recently with you transitioning from Northern Ireland to Stoke. And one of the things that Steve Davis was quoted as saying, as we picked out as super strength, was about the ability to give a team or develop self-belief within a team. How would you reflect upon that, and how did you make that stick?
Yeah, I think, well, you know, the Northern Ireland team was not in a great place when I found it, really. I had a disappointing campaign and finished with 4 straight defeats in the qualification for Euro 2012, and actually, you know, I'd lost home and away to Estonia as well, which were obviously going to be seen as negative results. And so you can't just change that overnight. You know, the reality is if you were taking that job as a club job, you'd probably try and change the players, but you don't have that luxury as an international manager. So it took me a while to get to know the players as well. Like in sort of 6-7 months in the job, I'd had 9 days with them in terms of 3 friendly games, and there was a lot of chopping and changing in that, and it was very frustrating for me, because I must admit I never felt we were moving forward. I felt like it was 1 step forward, 3 steps back. We never seemed to be gelling. We never seemed to be getting any real momentum or progress into. And it was really after the first campaign that I started to look at. I had time then to look at the group in much more detail. And in all honesty, like for the first thing I had to do with them was basically be quite brutally honest with them and say, look, if we continue to move with the same habits that we have and in the same direction, we're not going to achieve anything, regardless of who's the manager. It won't matter. And you'll have decisions to make, because you're not winning games. International football is not fun. You're turning up and you're going away disappointed. You're getting criticised in the media at home. All things that a player that are very personal that you don't like. I said, so we need to change, and the only people that can change it are us in this room. And we had scenarios, for example, where I used quite a lot of data in that to support that argument in terms of player availability, for example, you know, and compared it to countries that were successful. So a good example of that was in my first campaign. Only 2 players played all 10 games, and that was Stephen Davis and Roy Carroll. And as a nation like Northern Ireland, you've no chance of being successful if that's only the case, because even like Russia and Portugal, who were in our group, they had players that had played, like Ronaldo played all 10 games, and you know, and Russia had 7 players that played all 10 games. So the consistency selection, consistency and availability is crucial, particularly in a small nation with limited resources. So I had to be quite blunt with the players and sort of say, look, you have to decide what you want out of your international career. Are you here just to pick up caps because that's what we're doing? Or are we here to have something that we can remember, and hopefully, you know, we can look back on our international career and have real pride in it, and have real, you know, some really great moments in it. And those were, I think that was probably the start of it. When I look back, my biggest sort of regret is that I didn't do that from the outset, but I didn't feel comfortable or secure enough in the position to do that. I was a relatively young manager going in to, and dealing with some, you know, very big players that were playing in the Premier League, who probably maybe wouldn't have wanted to hear that from me, to be honest, at that minute in time. But you know, they had to look at their own international careers and then decide what they wanted to come out. I felt at the time that we were vulnerable, that, you know, if we were too heavy-handed with players, they may retire, they may decide not to play, they may put their club careers first. So there was a balancing act there, and you know, getting Aaron Hughes back was a big thing for me, because it kind of showed the rest of the squad. I think it was a bit of a benchmark for me. And the available, you know, Stephen Davis, for example, incredibly available for me. Is, you know, I think Stephen over 8 years has been unavailable for 4 or 5 games with injury. You know, use him as a role model. You know, we have to, you know, if Stephen Davis is here, you need to have a good reason why you're not here. And those were things that I think slowly the culture changed. But the culture can only change when you're winning. I think it's really difficult to change the culture when you're not winning. And people always say that to me, and I, you know, talk a lot about this. And you know, I don't believe that there's ever a sporting organisation not winning who are going in saying our culture's great, it's really great being here, but we're happy getting beat every week. It just doesn't exist for me. I don't think. Now there's a challenge in that. I think so. For example, if you're possibly a team that gets promoted to the Premier League and you know you're going to be fighting for your life from day one, you can still have that positive culture within the group, but it'll be really tested within that. It'll really be tested, and that's something that I think once we started to win, it just momentum built to the point that players didn't want to miss out. They didn't, you know, if they felt they were injured, or they felt that, you know, they didn't want to miss being part of the international group. Whereas in the past, they made their decisions a little bit to suit themselves a little bit at times, and that's something that I think where the new manager is coming in, he's getting the group in a really good place. And that was where, obviously, it took me a bit of time to get it to that point in time, to that place.
Last one for me before I hand over to Michael to finish off with the last question. But do you feel it was a role you were growing into, that you maybe weren't sure that you were ready for it or not? And do you think that's something that, as coaches, all coaches should really be striving for, something that they're going to grow within the role, as opposed to be exactly ready for that role at that time?
Yeah, there's no doubt. Yeah, when I took the Northern Ireland job, there's no doubt. To say I was ready for it would have been lunacy, really, you know, because I hadn't managed in England. I'd managed a part-time club in Scotland for just over 2 years, and I'd managed the League of Ireland club for 3 years, albeit with a huge amount of success with that club. But the reason I took the job really was because I felt, if I'm not ready, I'm at a point in my career which is probably not going to damage me too much. But you do see situations, for example, Steve Staunton was given the chance to manage the Republic of Ireland with no managerial experience, and he subsequently never really had any management career after that. So you do take a risk in the decisions that you make. I made the decision and felt it would help my management career. I knew the job wasn't going to be easy. I knew that I felt that I could progress. I felt that I could help the situation. I could make the situation better. I didn't think that it would necessarily mean qualification and everything, but the bar was low, to be honest. And sometimes when you come in, that's not a bad scenario to be in when the bar is low. In my situation, often all the jobs that I've taken have been like that, really. Stoke City were bottom of the league when I took it. Shamrock Rovers were 7th and miles behind the teams that were at the top of the League of Ireland. Brecon had just been relegated from the Championship. So I think when you go in that situation, you've probably got a little bit of time, but more often than not, you rarely get jobs when things are going so well at a club. That rarely happens either. So you have to be prepared for that. But yeah, I think you should always back yourself when you go into that situation. Trust yourself. I remember being particularly nervous before the first game in meeting the first camp, and actually just meeting the players, speaking to the players, meeting them and getting to know them. And that's a process. You're a little bit out of your comfort zone, and you have to be prepared to deal with that. And I would encourage coaches to go outside your comfort zone. Like, it's amazing. That's the thing that will progress you the most of anything, I think. Because if you just stay within what you know and you don't take risks, it's hard to progress. You do have to take risks, both on a personal level and on your career level, and put yourself in situations that you're maybe not 100% comfortable. And by taking the Northern Ireland job, that's what I did.
And Michael, you've given us quite a lot here in terms of your insight into coaching. Just as we close off the conversation, is there anything we haven't asked you that you think would be really useful for coaches out there who are looking to improve or looking to develop? Is there anything that you think would be useful for them to know?
Yeah, I think, if you were asking me a question, how do I see coaching progressing in the future? I think we're gonna that will change. I think that football is a sport in particular that is quite traditional in how it coaches. The players, you warm up, you might do some part of a training drill, do a drill, and you finish. There's a lot of consistencies in how coaches work. I think that we're going to deal with players who are going to be much more individual, because they're now coming in, they're more self-analytical. So I think there's more and more coaching which is actually done off the pitch than on the pitch. So you're coaching with analysis. I think in many ways players prefer to be coached like that, because they're not maybe being highlighted in front of a group of people as well. I think the modern day player is more receptive to a one-on-one scenario and sitting with video and talking through things, and possibly you take him on the pitch, pointing out what he's doing wrong, and ultimately his teammates are watching that or assessing that happening. I think that part of coaching has changed and will continue to change. I think that the data and the availability of the data is something that players are striving for all the time, are constantly looking for, are constantly, benchmarking themselves against other people, whether it's someone in their position, someone on another team, someone that's earning more money than them, for example, are all factors that will be in players' heads. So I think we'll even move to coaching more in small group scenarios, and then the real challenge will be then how you bring that together as a team to formulate how you'll play as an 11. You do a lot of unit work and small work in football anyway, but it's the one thing I looked when I went to watch Irish rugby training with Joe Smith. I was amazed at how the forwards trained, and the backs were training. and how player led it was. It was so player led rugby, which is one of the led in the fact that when I watched the forwards train, you know, they were able to almost demand things of themselves, and the coach was there almost as a facilitator. Now, when Joe stepped in, everyone stood up to attention, and everyone was ears pricked up, and he would be running different things, and his attention to detail is obviously legendary as well. But I do think that it was Paul O'Connell actually. He was in the forwards, but he was essentially driving the session. It was so player led by him. It was brilliant to see it, you know, and how he was demanding so much of the players around him, although he wasn't the coach in the session. And I think that's something that, you know, I'm quite envious of. I think rugby had that better than us in football. We have a generation of quiet footballers now. So the days of, you know, you hear it consistently in the punditry, oh, there's no characters left, or there's no leaders left. People are saying that all the time. I just don't really believe that. I just think we have a different type of player now, and we won't get players like Roy Keane, for example. We won't get players like Graham Souness, going very few and far between in the future. So as coaches, there's no point sort of complaining about that. This is the type of individual that you have, and so you have to find how you're going to deal with that individual, and how you coach them will change, and how they expect to be coached. So you often see that when you put an older coach with younger players, and there's just a total disconnect, and the older coach, he just doesn't have, you know, because he's coached in such a way for a long period of time, if he hasn't adapted, it's difficult for him then to relate to the younger players, or them to relate to him. And I think that's where I would see, you know, whereas coaches and all of us, we're all constantly going to evolve, because of the athletes continually changing. They're consistently changing, and what is around the athlete is consistently changing, which is the challenge to the coach as well.
Fantastic. Michael, on behalf of Simon and myself and the organisation, it's been fantastic to get a glimpse into your insights into coaching and your experiences. I'd just like to genuinely thank you for taking the time to have a conversation with us here this afternoon.
Okay, listen, no problem. If you need anything else, just give me a shout through days, okay? And good luck with everything, okay?
Okay, for some reflection on that conversation. Simon, I got the feeling you enjoyed that. Would I be right?
Yeah, absolutely, Michael. I think listening to Michael O'Neill, it was certainly really, really enjoyable to be having that conversation with him. A coach, you know, that I've followed as a fan, I suppose, of watching the team as well, and certainly had a lot of pleasure in watching his teams play. So really, really one of those days, I suppose, sometimes you think, I wonder, is this actually a job we do, or is it a hobby we get paid for? So yeah, really enjoyed that. I think for me, in terms of probably on a more serious note, I think the thing for me that really stood out was his future focus. Really future focused coach, thinking about what's next. Where can I be looking? And a coach who really has their eyes open, both to their own sport and things they can learn from other coaches with their own sport, as well as other sports. And we heard him reference rugby and basketball, amongst other learning contexts, and learning from outside sport as well, that he was bringing into his coaching. And I think just with the theme of our podcast being very much about curiosity and trying to find ways of doing things better and doing things in new ways, I thought that was a really, really great start for us. What about yourself?
No, I absolutely agree. It was a wonderful insight into his thoughts behind the whole coaching aspect and the environment which he builds wherever he goes. And the big thing for me was that there seemed to be a real focus on a balance between the analytical side of coaching, so the data and the stats and the things that can help quantify the success or the environment that he creates, but also that aspect of relationships and how he supports people and allows people to be their best within the environment that Michael creates. And I think that was a really nice overview of the way he did things at Northern Ireland and the way he's looking to progress things at Stoke so far. And it was just fantastic, and certainly I think you're quite right. To be able to spend an afternoon with Michael O'Neill is certainly a great learning experience. And I really enjoy that personally, and hope our listeners do as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Michael. So just in closing, really like to thank everybody who's listened in to this episode, or this first episode of the Curious Coaching Podcast. It will be a monthly series, so we'll be back next month with the next episode and the next Curious Coach. In the meantime, we have a webinar, which is the next in our Webinar Wednesday series on the 3rd of June. And to get further information on that, you can visit sportni.net/learning/Webinar Wednesday. In the meantime, stay well, stay safe, and we look forward to you joining us hopefully next month. Thank you.
Curious Coaching is brought to you by Sport Northern Ireland. We hope that this episode has sparked some curiosity for you and your coaching. The future belongs to the curious.